12 men are packed into 6 steel capsules, the length of a city bus, heading toward the most heavily defended anchorage in Europe. Each capsule carries no gun, no torpedo, just 2 explosive charges bolted to the outside of the hull. The 22nd of September, 1943, Kaafjord, northern Norway. Behind minefields, torpedo nets, and patrol boats sits Tirpitz. 42,900 tons of steel, 8 15-inch guns, the largest battleship ever built in Europe. For 2 years and more, British bombers had tried again and again to reach her. Not one raid had done any serious damage. The Norwegian fjords and the Arctic weather had shielded her better than any armor plate. German command is certain that nature itself has made this anchorage unreachable. That certainty is wrong, and the cost of the mistake will become clear within a few hours. Of the 6 small submarines setting out on this raid, only 2 will still be moving by morning. 2 will be enough. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a crew of 4 squeezed a 50-foot steel capsule through defenses the Germans considered impossible to breach. Why a battleship that no bomb could touch nearly capsized from a charge planted by hand under her own keel. And what happened to the submarine that vanished in this fjord and was never found? Before we go on, one question for you personally. If you were asked to spend 18 hours inside a steel tube the size of a bus, knowing your odds of coming back were roughly 1 in 3, would you have volunteered? Tell us in the comments what you'd choose, and if someone in your family served at sea in that war, tell us about them too. Now, let's go back to where this started. To a ship that was feared more than an entire fleet. To understand why 12 men risked their lives for one ship, you first have to understand what that ship meant to Britain. In early 1941, at the personal urging of Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the battleship Tirpitz, twin of the sunk Bismarck, moved into Norwegian waters. The logic was simple. The mere fact of her presence somewhere Britain couldn't ignore was worth more than any convoy she might sink. Hitler, still cautious after the loss of Bismarck, approved the plan on one condition. The ship would stay close to the fjords and avoid the open ocean. From then on, Tirpitz sat in her Norwegian sanctuary. Altafjord, a long, narrow inlet carved by glaciers and walled in by sheer mountains, offered a kind of protection no dry dock or harbor ever could. Protection by terrain itself. Shifting winds threw aircraft off course. Submarines had no room to maneuver. The Germans regularly moved the battleship between anchorages, making any piece of intelligence obsolete before it reached headquarters. On top of that came minefields, hydrophone nets, and patrol boats. On the 30th of January, 1942, the Royal Air Force made its first attempt, Operation Oiled. Bombers took off, loaded with explosives. Norwegian weather, low cloud and fog, forced them to turn back without dropping a single bomb. That spring, Tirpitz went hunting on her own, in Operation Sportpalast, but sank only 1 merchant ship before carrier aircraft forced her to retreat. Over the following 3 months, bombers came back 3 more times. Every time the same story. Poor visibility, navigation errors, Norwegian weather covering the target again. In the summer of 1942, Tirpitz put to sea in Operation Røsselsprung, Knight's Move, and won her most significant victory without firing a single shot. When British intelligence detected her sailing, the Admiralty ordered convoy PQ-17 to scatter and make for Russia alone, without escort. German submarines and aircraft picked off the defenseless ships one by one.
The mere presence of the battleship cost Britain more than any broadside she ever fired. By autumn, after another round of failed raids, Tirpitz went back for repairs. Growing desperate, the British sent Norwegian resistance fighters to guide commandos toward the battleship on manned torpedoes called chariots. A storm scattered the small craft before they reached their target. In February 1943, Tirpitz was joined by Scharnhorst, and together they carried out Operation Sicilian against British bases on Spitzbergen. After that, Tirpitz moved further north, into Kaafjord, a narrow arm of Fjord, hidden among the mountains and shielded from aerial reconnaissance. There she earned her Norwegian nickname, the Lonely Queen of the North. By this point, taking her out of the war had stopped being optional. It had become urgent. On the 12th of September 1943, Soviet Captain Leonid Yelkin took his reconnaissance aircraft up over the Barents Sea, determined to finally get clear photographs of the battleship's new anchorage. The clouds sat at 2,000 feet. Rain cut visibility further, but that same weather gave him cover. After 2 hours in the air, he entered the narrow, twisting channels of the fjord system, straight into one of the densest anti-aircraft networks outside Germany itself. More than 80 guns, from rapid-fire 20mm cannon to heavy 105mm flak batteries. The flak opened up. Black bursts flashed just off his wingtips. Yelkin held his course, easing away from the worst of the fire until a gap in the clouds gave him his chance. Most pilots in his position would have taken a few shots from a distance and turned for home. Yelkin dropped to 160 feet, low enough that from an 800-foot battleship you could make out individual men on deck. His crew shot frame after frame before breaking out of the fjord and back into Soviet airspace. Within hours, the photographs were on the desks of British liaison officers in London. But even with intelligence that good, a conventional attack was still impossible. Bombers lacked the precision, surface ships couldn't navigate the channels, and an ordinary submarine would be spotted too soon. What was needed was something that could slip past every one of those barriers unseen. The answer already existed, in the cold waters off the coast of Scotland. By the third year of the war, with conventional strikes on key German targets failing again and again, the Royal Navy began developing a new kind of vessel. The result was the X-class submarine. Each one measured 51 feet long, with a crew of 4, a commanding officer, a pilot, an engineer, and a diver. No torpedo tubes, no deck guns. Everything unnecessary was stripped away. In their place, 2 explosive charges packed with thousands of pounds of Torpex hung on either side of the hull, meant to be dropped under a target's keel, set on a timer, and left behind. Underwater range was measured in hours, not days. Oxygen ran low fast. Even the periscope had to be raised by hand. The idea was championed by Commander Cromwell Varley, the man behind the whole concept of a craft like this, backed by Vice Admiral Sir Max Horton, and personally approved by Winston Churchill. The operation was named Source. Some of the intelligence on the fjord's defenses came from Norwegian resistance fighters, brothers Torbjorn and Einar Johansen, who mapped patrol patterns and passed word along through a network of fishing boats and clandestine radio transmissions.
Targets were assigned to the 6 submarines: X5, X6, X7, X8, X9, X10. X5, X6, and X7 were to attack Tirpitz simultaneously. X9 and X10 were assigned the battleship Scharnhorst, X8 the heavy cruiser Lutzow. Each tiny submarine had to be towed across hundreds of miles of open water behind larger fleet submarines that served as both mothership and lifeline for the whole crew. Inside the towing boats, space was unbearably tight. Condensation dripped from every surface, and the air grew thick with the stale heat of hours submerged. That's exactly why the attack crews didn't ride the whole way inside the X-craft itself. They were swapped in near the target, so the men arrived rested, not wrung out by a multi-day crossing. On the 11th of September, 6 towing pairs, the submarines Thrasher, Truculent, Stubborn, Sea Nymph, Syrtis, and Scepter, each with an X-craft in tow, put to sea and vanished into the cold water on the way to Norway.
The first 4 days of the crossing went by strangely calm for a stretch of ocean crawling with German submarines. On the 15th of September, as the convoy was turning toward Fjord, the tow cable between Syrtis and X9 suddenly snapped. The break came at the worst possible moment. The wet cable had been dragging the bow down, and X9 had been deliberately trimmed nose-heavy to fight the pull of the line. Once the tension vanished, the boat went straight to the bottom of the North Sea, with her entire relief crew aboard. The crew of X9, Sub-Lieutenant Karen, Able Seaman Hart, and Stoker Hollett, died to the last man. The only trace left on the surface was a film of oil. 2 days later, on the 17th, water began seeping into X8's charge compartment. Her commander hurriedly released the explosives and detonated them at what he judged to be a safe distance. The blast was far more powerful than expected and tore open the tiny submarine's hull.
The crew barely made it aboard the rescuing Sea Nymph before X8 had to be scuttled. By the 20th of September, the surviving boats had to press on alone, submerging by day and surfacing only at night, with a single task: reach Kaafjord by dawn. At dusk, the 4 remaining X-craft slipped their tows and turned toward Soy Sound. Before they parted ways, Lieutenant Henty Creer of X5 called good wishes across the water to Lieutenant Place, commanding X7. Those were the last words anyone would ever hear from the crew of X5. Meanwhile, X10 kept losing one system after another to mechanical failure. With half the flotilla already lost or disabled, Command cancelled the planned attacks on Scharnhorst and Lutzow. Of the 6 submarines that had left Scotland a little over a week earlier, only 2 were still heading for Tirpitz.
Lieutenant Donald Cameron guided X6 through the minefields and, by the evening of the 21st of September, took up position near the Bratholm Islands, a rocky archipelago guarding the entrance to Kaafjord. There his boat settled to the bottom, barely below the surface, and waited. Nearby, among the same islands, Lieutenant Place sheltered with X7. He watched Scharnhorst leave Fjord at 4:30 that afternoon, a target his own boat was no longer assigned to hit. Neither commander made contact with the other. Each waited alone. Tirpitz was ringed by 2 concentric belts of torpedo nets, a steel web meant to catch and stop anyone trying to approach underwater. Shortly before sunset, on the 22nd of September, sentries opened the outer boom to let a coastal supply vessel through. Cameron reacted instantly. X6 surged forward, diving in right behind the merchant ship's stern, and slipped through the gap seconds before the boom swung shut again. What followed tested Cameron to his limit. The periscope failed. Then the gyro compass gave out, and with no reliable instrument left, all he could do was steer the boat almost blind toward where he believed Tirpitz was lying. Aboard the German battleship, the morning had begun without the slightest warning. At 5 a.m., technicians shut down the hydrophone watch for scheduled maintenance on the underwater listening gear. With those acoustic ears gone dark, the crew posted extra lookouts on deck, scanning the still water of Kaafjord. Underwater, X6 pressed on until her hull struck an uncharted rock. The jolt sent a vibration through the boat that felt deafening to the crew inside. At 7:07 that morning, a German watchman noticed a slight disturbance in the water inside the net enclosure and put it down to a surfacing seal. 5 minutes later, the truth showed itself. X6 broke the surface for a moment. A German sailor raised the alarm. Enemy submarine sighted.
In the first chaotic seconds, the crew scrambled to launch a boat, while alarm bells wailed through the ship. But in the confusion, the wrong signal sounded. Instead of the specific alert for a submarine threat, the order rang out to seal watertight compartments. Most of Tirpitz's crew carried on with their morning duties, unaware of the danger under the keel. Even though he'd been spotted, Cameron kept moving, bringing X-6 in directly beneath the hull of the battleship. The British craft was now too close for Tirpitz's guns to depress far enough to hit her. The Germans could only watch as X-6 slipped back under the water. Beneath the enormous underside of Tirpitz, Cameron's crew worked with practiced precision, laying and arming their charges. The mission was done, and they knew there was no way back. A few minutes later, X-6 surfaced again. This time, a German boat was already waiting.
Coming alongside, the sailors climbed aboard the tiny craft, shorter than one of the battleship's own gun barrels, and took the British crew prisoner, but not before the crew had opened the flood valves. As X-6 went under, the Germans noted the defeated look on their prisoners' faces and concluded that, whatever the British plan had been, it had failed. Instead of getting underway at once, Tirpitz was ordered to raise steam in her boilers, a process that would take nearly an hour. At 7:40 that morning, lookouts spotted a second submarine. X-7, under Lieutenant Basil Place, was trying to withdraw through the net barrier after successfully placing her own charges beneath the battleship. Anti-aircraft machine guns opened fire immediately, tracing lines across the water. The destroyers Z-27 and Z-30 raced in, dropping depth charges that threw up huge columns of water. One blast landed close enough to badly damage X-7. The crippled boat drifted helplessly and tangled again in the torpedo nets. Place and one crewman managed to get clear of the sinking submarine. The rest stayed inside as X-7 went down. The Germans pulled the two survivors from the freezing water and brought them aboard Tirpitz to join their comrades from X-6 as prisoners. Despite the noise, the searchlights, and the confused orders aboard, the charges were already in place, the timers already running, and there was nothing anyone on Tirpitz could do to stop them. Facing the impossibility of knowing for certain whether his ship was mined, Tirpitz's commanding officer, Captain Hans Meyer, decided to act. With no time to raise full steam and move under her own power, he ordered the crew to slowly swing the great hull around on her anchors and mooring cables, turning her side away from where he judged the danger might be coming from. The desperate effort came too late to change anything. At 8:12 that morning, two explosions went off underwater, almost simultaneously. The whole 42,900-ton battleship heaved nearly 3 feet out of the water. The hull shuddered so violently that armor plate buckled under stress it had never been built to withstand. A fuel tank burst, and a massive hole tore through the double bottom. Close to 1,400 tons of freezing water surged into the lower compartments, flooding corridors and living spaces. The mighty Tirpitz shook as power failed across most of the ship. Both generator rooms flooded, and the propeller shafts seized solid in their bearings. Two enormous gun turrets were torn off their mounts. Anti-aircraft guns were twisted at grotesque angles, and rangefinders and fire control equipment were shaken loose from their brackets. Every radar set went dark, and the blast was violent enough to hurl 2 seaplane spotters off their catapults and smash them against the water. But the attack wasn't over. At 8:43, as panic and confusion spread through the wounded battleship, lookouts spotted a third submarine, roughly 700 yards out. The few surviving flak guns opened fire, and the destroyer Z-27 raced toward the target. It was X-5, the same boat that had vanished after Lieutenant Henty Creer's parting words 3 days earlier. Having navigated the maze of fjords entirely on her own, this submarine had taken up position outside the torpedo nets, waiting for her chance to strike the already crippled battleship. After taking several hits from German gunfire, the small craft slipped under the water. Z-27 blanketed the area with depth charges, throwing up walls of water that hid everything happening below. Neither the crew nor any wreckage of X-5 was ever found. Her fate remained the one unsolved mystery of Operation Source. Of the 6 submarines that set out, only 2 reached their target.
That was enough to seriously cripple the lonely Queen of the North. That same day, German command sent 2 generator ships to the stricken battleship. Tirpitz, listing 30 degrees to one side, stayed afloat. More than 1,400 tons of water had already flooded her lower compartments. One blast had gone off near a turret, the other along the port bow, tearing open the plating, rupturing a fuel tank, and buckling internal bulkheads. To correct the growing list, the crew had 2 counterflood compartments on the starboard side. Inside, the electrical systems were wrecked. Every turbo generator in the second generator room was knocked out, and nearly every generator in the first room had failed when steam lines burst and cables were severed. One of the massive gun turrets was twisted on its base so badly it could no longer rotate, and there was nowhere to fix it. Not a single crane in all of Norway could lift and realign it. On the 25th of September, with Hitler's personal approval, German command decided to repair the battleship in place. It quickly became clear that restoring her to full fighting condition would be impossible. Many of the hull's structural frames had buckled in the blasts, damage that could only be fixed in a dry dock during a long stay at a proper shipyard. And yet the crew of Tirpitz, backed by specialists from the floating repair workshop Neumark, did what many considered impossible. Over the next 6 months, without heavy cranes or a dry dock, through the polar winter and polar darkness, they brought the battleship back to fighting condition. According to historians William Garsky and Robert Doolin, the repair stands as one of the most notable feats of naval engineering carried out anywhere during the Second World War. In London, Winston Churchill made destroying Tirpitz the highest possible priority. The hunt intensified after Scharnhorst went down off the North Cape on the 26th of December. With Lützow and most of the destroyers recalled to Germany, the full weight of the British fleet closed in on one elusive target. Soviet bombers struck first, on the 10th of February, scoring one hit that did little damage. By April, Tirpitz had completed sea trials and returned to her anchorage in Fjord, and the Royal Navy launched Operation Tungsten, throwing carrier aircraft at the battleship. 14 direct hits and 1 near miss tore through the ship. 122 men were killed and 300 more wounded. Water poured into compartments, turrets jammed, spotter planes burned on their catapults, and still the armored deck held. The months that followed, Operations Planet, Brawn, and Tiger Claw, broke against the harsh Norwegian weather. Operation Mascot fell apart when German radar picked up the incoming aircraft. Smokescreens hid the battleship completely. 4 consecutive Goodwood operations in August landed only 2 hits. The Royal Air Force brought in Lancasters carrying new 5-ton Tallboy bombs, built to punch through an armored deck before detonating. On the 11th of September, 38 of these heavily armed bombers struck in Operation Paravane. Despite the smokescreens, 2 bombs hit the forecastle, exploding beneath the ship and causing enormous damage. After that, German command declared the battleship unfit for sea and towed her to Hokoya, near Tromsø, to serve as a floating gun battery, a fatal decision
that put her within range of British Lancasters flying straight out of Scotland. On the 12th of November, 1944, in Operation Catechism, more than 24 Lancasters dropped their bombs. 2 direct hits and a near miss rolled Tirpitz onto her port side. The list grew past 60 degrees before a tremendous explosion tore the hull apart. The mighty battleship capsized, burying more than 1,000 of her crew inside. The lonely Queen of the North was finally beaten, and the Arctic convoys that the tiny submarines had fought so hard to protect a year earlier could now sail to Murmansk in safety. The prisoners from X6 and X7 survived the war and came home to Britain once it ended. The commanders of both boats, Lieutenant Donald Cameron and Lieutenant Basil Place, received the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for courage. Their official citation, published in the London Gazette in February 1944, states that both officers worked their small craft past dense anti-submarine and torpedo nets with a complete disregard for danger, and when withdrawal became impossible under gunfire and depth charges, scuttled their own boats rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Place spent the rest of the war in the prisoner-of-war camp Marlag Nord, where he took part in the famous escape that became known as Albert RN. After his release, he was offered a routine posting rather than a submarine command, supposedly because he lost too much time as a prisoner. Place turned away from submarines and moved into naval aviation instead. He died on the 27th of December, 1994, in London, a man who spent the war getting as close to mortal danger as possible, and spent the rest of his life finding a way out of whatever situation he landed in. Cameron stayed in the Navy, rose to commander, and took charge of several submarines, including one later named in his honor, X6. He died on the 10th of April, 1961, in Portsmouth, still on active service. The crew of X9, Curran, Hart, and Hollett, died in the first days of the voyage, drowned with their boat when a tow cable snapped.
The crew of X5, Henty Creer, Nelson, Malcolm, and Mortiboy vanished in the very hour that brought victory to their comrades, and never received a single posthumous honor, because no one could ever prove exactly what they did in their final minutes. 80 years on, the place where X5 went down remains unsolved. Of the 6 steel capsules that left Scotland, 4 never reached their target. By any conventional measure, that looks like a failed operation. And yet the 2 submarines that made it through did something 2 years of bombers, carrier aircraft, and full-sized submarines had never managed. They took the most powerful battleship in Europe out of the war for 6 months. It was not one crushing blow that did it. It was a handful of men squeezing tiny steel capsules through defenses the German command genuinely believed were impossible to breach. German command wasn't wrong that the terrain, the nets, and the minefields made a conventional attack suicidal. They were wrong about something else. They assumed that if the ordinary methods couldn't get through, nothing could. 12 men in 6 tin cans the size of a bus proved otherwise, and paid for that proof in a currency split evenly between the men who received the Victoria Cross and the men whose names are remembered only on a list of the missing.